Okay, now we can record. And tell me about this when you flew into Thomas Creek.
The best airplane I ever flew in the backcountry, even better than a 6000 Travel, was called a Cunningham Hall. It was a big biplane. It had a 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone engine of 440 horsepower with a constant speed propeller. The airplane cruised at about 120 miles an hour. It was 6th place, and I took 4 people and their baggage into Thomas Creek for their hunting trip. And when I get to Thomas Creek, and it was cloudy and low clouds and stuff, and I was flying the canyons to get in there, when I landed at Thomas Creek, this one fellow said, "Boy, am I glad to see you." And I said, "Why?" Because I had not flown them in there. And he said, "We're going out with you." And I said, "Well, who brought you in?" And he said, "Well, Bill Woods, but he's not coming." And I said, "Well, I've got to call Bill because he was a friend of mine, and I couldn't steal any of his passengers or company." So I said, "We'll go over to the lodge and I'll call him on the radio telephone and see if he's coming. And if he's not coming, I'll haul you out." Okay, so that's what we did. And Bill told me that he was not coming in because of the clouds and the weather. And I said, "Well, Bill, I'm already in here, and they're anxious to get out." And he said, "They're yours, take them." And I said, "Okay." So I went out there, and there were 4 men. They had 8 deer, 5 big bucks with horns, and 3 does, plus all of their baggage, tents, and camping gear. And I put that in that airplane, and they were carrying horns around their head, and the deer were laying on their laps and stuffed underneath the seat. And I finally got it in, and I was carrying more than 2,000 pounds of freight in that airplane. And I looked back there when it was loaded and we were ready to take off, and I said, "I don't think this thing will ever get off the ground. I've only got 1,900 feet of runway." And I opened that throttle, and that thing jumped off in about 1,000 feet. And I went out over the river, and I turned around, and I came back up the river, flying over Indian Creek, up Pistol Creek, over Sulphur Creek, up Bear Valley, and out. And I leveled off about 120 miles an hour. I get back out there and land at the Floating Feather Airport, and I unloaded all of that stuff for them. They paid me my fee, and then I had to fly over to Gowan Field to park the airplane because that's where we were based.
What year was that, Harold?
Oh, that was about 1955, I think.
Wow. You were just a youngster. Well, these guys now that fly into the backcountry, a lot of these airplanes are specifically designed for this backcountry flying, and you guys didn't have that advantage. You had to take the airplanes that you had.
We were flying junk sometimes that we got out of the junkyard. I went over to Sun Valley, Haley, and we knew that there was a Fairchild 71 fuselage that had been all prepared for cover, but they decided not to go ahead with it. And the boss and I went over there with a truck and trailer, and they told us that we could have the airframe if we wanted to come and get it. And it had
your hand. It's blocking your face out. Your hand is blocking your face out. Yeah, there you go. A man that talks with his hands, there's nothing wrong with that.
I'm sorry, I forgot I was on the camera.
I know it. But no, the stories are great.
We went over there to the Haley to get this airframe, and they said, "Well, it's out in the back in the junk pile." We went out there, and there was a frame beautifully prepared, all chromated, had chromate paint on it, and 1 landing gear. And the boss said, "That's okay, Harold." He said, "I got the other landing gear." And I said, "All right, let's haul it home." So we took that Fairchild 71, which is a folding wing airplane, and I said, "We need an engine." And he said, "I found one on a B-15 training airplane, BT-15. that was like the BT-13, and the BT-13 had a 450 Pratt, and the BT-15 had a 440 Wright. You couldn't tell the difference in the performance because they had constant speed propellers on them. And so I got in my little airplane and flew a captain on the Empire Airlines up into Washington to pick up the airplane, and he flew that BT-15 back to Boise so we could take the engine off of it and put it on our Fairchild.
By the way, folks, there's all this commentary in Harold's book. I've just finished reading this portion of this flight, but I wanted to say you can read all of this in Harold's book. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then we took that engine and the prop, and we finally finished up that Fairchild 71, and I think we sold that to Johnson. At least they had a Fairchild 71 afterwards, and I think that's who.
What year Fairchild would have that been?
It was
about 47 or 48? No, or before the war.
This was after the war that I was building the airplane because I was working as a mechanic. I didn't have my commercial license yet, but I was in training. And I got my training from pilots who trained military pilots for the World War II. Mm-hmm. And so I went through the same course they did. But anyway, getting back to the story, we finished up the Fairchild 71, covered it and everything, and then I didn't fly the airplane, but Jim Larkin flew the airplane. He flew for Johnson Flying Service, and I chased him around in the backcountry sometimes and helped him get that thing started. So I was well aware of the airplane and how to fly it and how to maintain it as a mechanic. But that's the way it went on the Fairchild 71.
And the story in the book is real interesting because you have a problem with your airplane flying out over northern Oregon and near Pilgrim is that Pilgrim Pass up there? And
on the way back.
Oh, and LaGrange.
I landed at LaGrange, Oregon for gas, and I had to stay there overnight because it was dark. I walked back out to the airport the next morning, and I was flying this little monoplane with a 5-cylinder radial engine in it and a fixed pitch prop, metal. And I took off from that airport and was flying up over the Blue Mountains when I had an engine problem with it and almost had to land. But I said, I'm not going to go down as long as I can get power out of this engine. I'm going to fly the thing till it quits. And I flew from the Blue Mountains in Oregon clear to Bradley Field in Boise, Idaho with that rattling, banging engine, and I landed there safely. And when I got out of it, I looked to see what was the matter with it, and it broke the side. The push rod on one cylinder, on number 4 cylinder, broke the side of the rocker arm out, and I lost power in that one cylinder. The next day I came out and took that cylinder off, and being a welder and a blacksmith, I took it down to the shop and I welded that head back together. It was aluminum, and I welded it in the shop, put it back together, and I found out that the mechanic before me had put the push rods, the rockers, in the wrong way. The intake rockers are on the exhaust side and the exhaust rockers are on the inside, and so the push rod came up, it jumped out of the side of the rocker and jammed it into the side of the rocker housing and broke the side out, but I didn't lose any parts. And so when I get back to Bradley Field, I removed the cylinder, took it down to the shop, and totally re-welded that on, painted the cylinder, and you could not tell that thing had ever been broken. and I put that back in with new rings, and I changed all the rockers, and I never had another problem with that Warner engine. It was
Wow.
a 5-cylinder Warner.
Hey, Harold, can I ask you about flying Ford Trimotors?
Yes.
Yeah, I know that you flew them during that period, the Ford Trimotors.
I flew Trimotors for Bradley Mining Company in 1956 and 57.
Wow.
Yeah, that's when we were hauling freight and doing stuff. We hauled 2 bridges that go into the backcountry. One of them goes across the Middle Fork of the Salmon, and the other one crosses Big Creek just up above the Plan B Ranch, where the Big Creek comes into the Salmon River. We did that with 2 airplanes, with a tri-motor Ford and with a 6000 Travel Air. I used the 6000 Travel Air to fly all of the cement, bags of cement and small parts of the bridge in the 6000 Travel Air down to Bernard Creek, which is just past Plan B Ranch. Then they loaded all that junk on a rubber boat that had 3 Johnson motors on it. This rubber boat was big enough for 10 men in the military. It was an ex-military boat. And we had 3 Johnson motors on there and 2 men that took that down to the bridge site and unloaded them.
Wow.
And they could float down the river without using power, but then they could come back up. They used 1 engine going down and 3 engines coming back. And then they would load up all the stuff that I dropped off at the Plan B with the tri-motor, or at Bernard Creek with the Travel Air.
And you got, when you're doing all that flying, were you based mostly at Boise Airport or Gowan Field?
When I was flying the Travel Air, we set up a base at Salmon, and then I flew from there because it was only a half-hour flight in and a half-hour flight back, whereas the other way it would be an hour and a half. So we saved a lot of flying time that way. But I made 37 round trips from Salmon, Idaho, into the Plan B Ranch and Bernard Creek in 1 week.
That's in the Ford Trimotor?
No, the 6000 Travel Air.
Travel Air.
Yeah, I made 37 round trips in that airplane.
Hey, Harold, these airstrips you were landing at back in the backcountry in those days, were those paid for mostly by the government or by private people, or just...
Some of them were private and some of them belonged to the state.
Oh, okay.
There were some Forest Service fields.
Okay.
But, and we landed on them too.
Yeah.
But Bernard Creek is a state-owned field.
In the 50s, were they using airplanes to drop water onto fires, or were those fires mostly fought with
back then, we used tri-motors to drop supplies and firefighters by parachute onto the fires. But I didn't fly any water on them until later.
Okay.
I was flying a B-25 bomber as a fire bomber.
Oh, okay. You've told me about that before.
Yeah, I did that a little bit.
Okay. That wasn't your main occupation, though, the B-25.